The heart monitor screamed a flatline warning as the sterile operating room doors violently swung open. A police officer marched in, ignoring the horrified gasps of the surgical team. Without a word of hesitation, he clamped cold steel handcuffs onto the wrists of the brilliant surgeon holding a man's beating heart. Dr. Taryn Holden was not a man who panicked. At 42, he was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Seattle Metropolitan Hospital, a man whose hands had pulled hundreds of patients back from the absolute brink of death. He was known for a terrifyingly calm demeanor, a quiet baritone voice that could steady the most chaotic trauma rooms, and an immaculate obsessive dedication to his craft. Terrence was one of the few top-tier black surgeons in his highly specialized field, a reality that meant he had spent his entire life working twice as hard to prove he belonged in rooms he was already running. It was a blistering Tuesday morning in mid-October when the call came. Terrence had been halfway through a rare morning off sipping coffee on his porch when his phone shattered the silence. It was the hospital, an aortic dissection. The patient was a 71-year-old male, crashing fast. Time was no longer just of the essence. It was evaporating. Terrence sprinted to his car, a sleek, dark, gray Aston Martin he had bought himself after making chief of surgery, and tore through the rain-slicked streets of downtown Seattle. He didn't bother with the doctor's parking garage. He pulled straight into the emergency vehicle bay, slammed the car into park, threw the keys at a bewildered security guard, and sprinted through the sliding glass doors wearing a dark hoodie and sweatpants. He didn't look like a renowned surgeon in that moment. He looked like a man running for his life. From the corner of the street, sitting in his idling patrol cruiser, Officer Bradley Lawson watched the scene unfold. Lawson was a 12-year veteran of the force with a notoriously short fuse and a disciplinary file thick with complaints of excessive force and racial profiling. Complaints that had always been quietly swept under the rug by his union buddies. When Lawson saw a tall black man in a hoodie jump out of a $4 million sports car and run into the hospital, his mind immediately jumped to one conclusion: grand theft auto. He didn't see a doctor responding to an emergency. He saw a criminal fleeing a stolen vehicle. Without calling it in, Lawson flipped on his sirens, parked his cruiser aggressively behind the Aston Martin, and stormed into the hospital. 3 floors up, Terrence was already a different man. The hoodie was gone, replaced by blue scrubs. His hands were scrubbed, sterilized, and gloved. The tension in operating room 4 was thick enough to choke on. The patient on the table was in critical condition. His chest cavity was open, the rib retractors fully deployed, exposing a heart that was struggling to pump. Blood pressure is tanking, 70/40 and dropping, announced Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead anesthesiologist, her eyes glued to the monitors. I see it, Terrence said, his voice a low, steady hum that instantly grounded the room. The dissection has extended into the aortic arch suction. Cynthia, give me better visibility. Cynthia Brooks, the veteran scrub nurse, moved with synchronized precision, handing him instruments before he even had to ask. Vitals are getting erratic, Dr. Holden. We need to put him on bypass right now. Clamp the aorta, Terrence commanded. His gloved fingers were literally inside the patient's chest, navigating the most delicate, unforgiving anatomy in the human body. One slip, 1 millimeter of error, and the man on the table would bleed out in seconds. Downstairs, Officer Lawson was bullying his way past the front desk. I'm looking for a suspect who just ran in here. He barked at the terrified receptionist. Sir, you can't just wander around. This is a hospital, she stammered. But Lawson was already pushing through the double doors leading to the surgical wing, ignoring the bold red signs that read, restricted area, authorized personnel only. Security tried to intercept him, but Lawson shoved a hand against the guard's chest. Interfere with a police investigation and you're going to jail for obstruction, he spat. Back in or 4, the delicate dance of saving a life was reaching its climax. Terrence was completely submerged in his focus. He had the aortic clamp in his right hand. Then the sterile doors burst open. The loud bang of the heavy doors hitting the walls made everyone in the room jump. Cynthia gasped. Dr. Mitchell whipped her head around. Officer Bradley Lawson stomped into the room. He wasn't wearing a mask, scrubs, or shoe covers. His heavy mud-caked boots tracked dirt directly onto the pristine floor. Hey, Cynthia yelled, stepping forward. You cannot be in here. This is a sterile field. Shut your mouth and back up. Lawson barked, his hand resting aggressively on his utility belt, his eyes locked onto Terrence, who was leaning over the operating table, his hands deep inside the patient. You step away from the table now. Terrence didn't even look up. He couldn't. I am in the middle of a critical operation. Get out of my oar. I said step away from the table. Lawson yelled, marching closer. The sheer absurdity of the situation paralyzed the room. A police officer was screaming in a surgical theater. Officer, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and terror. If he moves his hands, this patient will die in less than 30 seconds. You need to leave. I'm not going to tell you again, boy, Lawson growled, the racial slur slipping out with a venomous ease that chilled the blood of everyone in the room. He closed the distance, stopping mere inches from the sterile blue drapes. You're under arrest for grand theft auto and fleeing the scene. Put your hands behind your back. I am a surgeon, Terrence said, his voice eerily calm despite the raging storm inside him. He finally shifted his eyes, locking a dead, furious stare onto the officer. That is my car downstairs. My ID is in my locker. If you touch me, this man dies, and I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your life in federal prison for manslaughter. Now get the hell out of my operate. The defiance, the sheer authority in Terrence's voice snapped something inside Lawson's fragile ego. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by a black man. Red-faced and furious, Lawson lunged forward. I don't care who you claim to be, Lawson roared. Before anyone could stop him, the officer reached over the sterile drape, grabbed Terrence's left arm, the arm stabilizing the patient's heart, and wrenched it violently backward. No, screamed Cynthia, dropping a tray of clamps that clattered violently against the tile floor. The heart monitor instantly responded to the violent jolt. The steady rhythmic beeping spiraled into a chaotic, rapid alarm. Vitals are crashing. He's hemorrhaging, Dr. Mitchell shrieked, her hands flying over the dials of the anesthesia machine. Terrence fought back, not throwing a punch, but anchoring his weight to keep his right hand steady inside the patient's chest. You are killing him. Let go of me. Terrence roared, the legendary calm finally shattering. Cynthia, page Dr. Pierce, stat. Tell him to get in here now. Lawson ignored the screaming monitors and the blood. He unclipped his handcuffs, yanked Terrence's left wrist behind his back, and clamped the steel tight. Terrence was now effectively pinned, one arm handcuffed, the other still desperately trying to hold a torn aorta together. You're assaulting a police officer, Lawson shouted, pulling out his taser and pressing it directly against Terrence's rib cage. Pull your other hand out right now, or I swear to God, I will light you up. Terrence looked at the taser, then at the dying man on the table, and then at the madman in the police uniform. If Lawson tossed him, the electrical shock would course through Terrence's body directly into the patient's exposed heart, killing him instantly. Holden, Dr. Gregory Pierce, the senior attending surgeon, burst through the doors, still tying his mask, having sprinted from the adjacent scrub room. He froze at the sight of the cop holding a taser to his chief of surgery. What in God's name is happening here? Greg, scrub in. Take over right now. Terrence pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. Clamp the descending aorta. He's tearing. Pierce didn't ask questions. He shoved past Lawson, practically throwing his sterile gown over his shoulders, and plunged his hands into the surgical field, taking over the precise grip Terrence was holding. I've got it. I've got him, Pierce said, sweat instantly breaking out on his forehead. Get this maniac out of here. The second Pierce had control, Lawson yanked Terrence away from the table with brutal force. He twisted Terrence's right arm behind his back, clicking the second cuff into place. Terrence's gloves were still coated in the patient's blood, some of which smeared onto Lawson's uniform. You're going away for a long time, pal, Lawson sneered, forcefully shoving Terrence toward the door. You have no idea what you've just done, Terrence said, his chest heaving. He looked back at the table where Pierce was frantically barking orders to stabilize the bleeding. If that man dies, his blood is on your hands. Save it for the judge, Lawson mocked. Lawson marched Dr. Taryn Holden out of operating room 4. The scene in the hallway was something out of a surreal nightmare. Nurses, doctors, and orderlies stopped dead in their tracks, their jaws dropping in utter disbelief. Here was their chief of surgery, a man revered across the Pacific Northwest, being paraded down the corridor in bloodied scrubs, handcuffed like a violent criminal. "Dr. Holden?" a young resident asked, stepping forward. "Back off," Lawson barked, resting his hand on his holster. Terrence kept his chin high. He refused to struggle, refused to give this racist, power-tripping cop any excuse to use physical violence. He walked with a terrifying dignity, his mind racing not with fear for himself, but with surgical algorithms, praying that Pierce could repair the aortic tear in time. They reached the lobby. Patients in the waiting room pulled out their cell phones, recording the spectacle. The hospital's chief administrator, Richard Olston, came sprinting out of the elevator, his face pale with horror. "Officer, officer, halt right there," Olston demanded, his voice echoing across the atrium. "I am Richard Olston, the head of this hospital. You have exactly 3 seconds to uncuff my chief of surgery before I have our legal department end your career." Lawson scoffed, looking Olston up and down. "Your chief of surgery is a car thief who resisted arrest. If you interfere, I'll take you in too." "A car thief," Olston yelled, completely losing his corporate composure. "That Aston Martin belongs to him. He's been working here for 10 years. He makes 5 times your salary, you ignorant fool." For a fraction of a second, a flicker of doubt crossed Lawson's eyes. But his pride was too far committed. He doubled down, shoving Terrence toward the glass exit doors. "He'll have to prove that at the precinct. Move." Lawson shoved Terrence into the back of the sweltering patrol cruiser, slamming the door shut. As the cruiser sped away from the hospital, sirens blaring, Terrence sat in the cramped back seat. The metallic taste of adrenaline coated his tongue. He looked down at his blood-stained hands restricted by the tight metal cuffs. At the precinct, Terrence was dragged out, paraded through the bullpen of the police station. The other officers looked up from their desks, some confused, some smirking. Lawson marched him to the booking desk. "Got a runner. Grand theft auto, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer," Lawson announced proudly to the desk sergeant, a tired-looking man named Sullivan. Sullivan looked at Terrence's blue surgical scrubs, the stethoscope still hanging around his neck, and the blood on his hands. "Lawson, where the hell did you pick him up?" "Seattle Metropolitan." Guy was trying to blend in. "I am Dr. Terran Holden," Terrence said, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet precinct. Every key stopped clicking. Every eye turned to him. "I was in the middle of a life-saving open-heart surgery. This officer breached a sterile operating room, assaulted me, and abandoned a dying man on a table." Sullivan's face drained of color. He looked at Lawson. "Bradley, tell me you didn't pull a doctor out of an or." "He's lying. He's a thief," Lawson insisted, though his voice had lost its confident edge. Before Sullivan could process the paperwork, the heavy wooden doors of the precinct's front entrance flew open. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't the hospital administrator. It was Captain Thomas Harding, the chief of police, completely out of breath. His face a mask of absolute, unadulterated terror. He had his phone pressed to his ear, and he was shaking. Harding locked eyes with Lawson and then looked at Terrence, who was still standing in handcuffs. "Uncuff him," Harding whispered, his voice trembling so violently it barely carried across the room. "Captain, he's a suspect," Lawson started. "I said uncuff him," Harding roared, a sound so loud and explosive that several officers jumped out of their chairs. Harding marched across the room, his eyes bulging with panic. He grabbed Lawson by the collar of his uniform, practically lifting the officer off his toes. "Do you have any idea what you've just done, Lawson? Do you have any idea who is on that operating table right now?" Lawson swallowed hard, the first true spike of fear piercing his chest. "No, sir, I was just following procedure." Harding threw Lawson backward into the booking desk. The captain turned to Terrence, his hands trembling as he personally fumbled with the keys to unlock the handcuffs. "Dr. Holden," Harding choked out, his eyes wide with a fear that bordered on hysteria. "The patient, the man you were operating on. We just got the call from the mayor's office." Terrence rubbed his bruised wrists, his dark eyes boring a hole through the captain, and then slowly shifting to Lawson, who was now backed against the wall. "I know exactly who he is, Captain," Terrence said softly, the silence in the precinct now deafening. "The question is, does your officer know that he just signed the death warrant of a federal judge?" The name echoed through the dead silence of the police precinct like a gunshot. Federal Judge Arthur V. Pendleton. Pendleton wasn't just a judge. He was the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington, a man who had built a 40-year career delivering uncompromising verdicts, presiding over the region's highest-profile corruption cases and sending dirty cops, mobsters, and cartel bosses to federal penitentiaries. He was a pillar of the judicial system, a personal friend to senators, and heavily protected by the U.S. Marshals. And Bradley Lawson had just ripped the only man capable of saving Pendleton's life away from the operating table. All the color drained from Lawson's face. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to grab the edge of the booking desk to keep from collapsing. "Captain, I didn't know," Lawson stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. He was in a hoodie. He was running from a stolen Aston Martin. "The car is registered to him, you absolute imbecile," Captain Harding screamed, his spit hitting Lawson's face. Harding didn't waste another second on the disgraced officer. He grabbed Dr. Terrence Holden by the shoulder. "Doctor, my cruiser is out front. We are leaving right now. My hands are contaminated," Terrence said coldly, looking at his bare, blood-crusted fingers. "If I go back in, I lose precious minutes scrubbing again. Every second, Pendleton is bleeding out. I will drive 90 miles an hour on the sidewalk if I have to," Harding vowed, his voice trembling with desperation. "Please, Dr. Holden." As Terrence turned to leave, he glanced back at Lawson, who was now hyperventilating against the wall. "Keep him here," Terrence told the desk sergeant. "Because if that judge dies, I want to know exactly where to send the FBI." The ride back to Seattle Metropolitan Hospital was a blur of blaring sirens and screeching tires. Captain Harding drove with reckless abandon, blowing through red lights and dodging traffic down Pike Street. Terrence sat in the passenger seat, his eyes closed, mentally visualizing the thoracic cavity, planning his exact approach the second he got back into the sterile field. He had to compartmentalize the boiling rage inside him. Anger was a luxury a surgeon couldn't afford. The cruiser slammed to a halt in the ambulance bay. Terrence kicked the door open and sprinted. The hospital was in absolute chaos. U.S. Marshals in tactical gear had already descended upon the building, securing the perimeter and flooding the surgical wing. Richard Olston, the hospital administrator, was waiting at the scrub station with two nurses holding open a fresh, sterile gown and gloves. "Holden, Pierce is losing him," Olston yelled over the commotion. The dissection tore further down, the descending aorta. Terrence shoved his hands under the scalding water, scrubbing with mechanical fury. "Tell him to push 50,000 units of heparin. Prepare the Dacron graft." Seconds later, Terrence kicked open the doors to operating room 4. The scene was a bloodbath. The suction canisters were completely full, bubbling with bright red arterial blood. The monitors were screaming in a horrifying symphony of critical alarms. Dr. Gregory Pierce looked up, his eyes wide with panic above his mask. He was quite literally holding Judge Pendleton's life in his hands, using his fingers to pinch a catastrophic rupture in the aortic wall. "Terry, thank God," Pierce gasped, his voice shaking. "I can't get the clamp lower. The tissue is too friable. It's like wet tissue paper. He's going into hypovolemic shock." "I've got it, Greg. Step back," Terrence said, his legendary baritone voice instantly cutting through the panic. Terrence stepped up to the table. The anger, the humiliation of the handcuffs, the racist slurs, he boxed it all up and shoved it into the darkest corner of his mind. Right now, he was not a victim. He was a god of the operating room. "Dr. Mitchell, drop his core temp to 18 degrees Celsius," Terrence commanded, his hands moving with blinding speed. "We are going into deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. I need to shut down blood flow completely to repair this arch." 18 degrees? Terrence, his brain, Mitchell started. "If we don't, he bleeds out in 2 minutes." "Do it," Terrence ordered. For the next 45 minutes, the room operated on a razor's edge. Terrence systematically removed the damaged, shredded sections of the judge's aorta, replacing them with a synthetic Dacron tube graft. His hands, which had been violently wrenched behind his back less than an hour ago, were perfectly steady. He sewed the tiny, immaculate stitches with the precision of a watchmaker. Warming him back up, Mitchell announced finally, her voice soaked in relief. "Re-establishing blood flow." The room held its collective breath. Terrence slowly released the surgical clamps, allowing the blood to flow through the new synthetic graft. He watched the repair line intensely. Not a single drop of blood leaked. The repair held. Slowly, the heart monitor transitioned from chaotic, erratic spikes back to a strong, steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Terrence took a slow, agonizingly deep breath, closing his eyes as a drop of sweat rolled down his forehead. Pressure 120/80. Stable, Mitchell whispered, almost as if she were afraid speaking too loudly would break the spell. You did it, Terrence. He's stable. Terrence stepped back from the table, pulling off his bloody gloves. His wrists were bruised purple and black from the tight steel handcuffs, throbbing with a dull ache he was only just now allowing himself to feel. Close him up, Greg, Terrence said quietly. He turned and walked out of the operating room. When Judge Arthur V. Pendleton woke up in the intensive care unit 3 days later, the first face he saw was his wife's. The second was the stern, sharply dressed director of the FBI's Seattle field office. As the judge slowly regained his faculties, he was briefed on exactly what had transpired while his chest was cut open. He was told about the rogue officer, the racial profiling, the violent arrest of the surgeon holding his heart, and the sheer miracle that Dr. Taryn Holden had made it back in time to save his life. Pendleton, a man who had dedicated his life to the rigid enforcement of the law, did not react with relief. He reacted with a cold, terrifying wrath. I want that officer's badge, Pendleton rasped, his voice weak but laced with venom. And I want him in federal custody by midnight. The fallout was apocalyptic. Bradley Lawson's career didn't just end, it was obliterated. The body cam footage from the hospital lobby showing Lawson dragging a bloodied, handcuffed surgeon through a crowd of terrified patients was leaked to the press by an anonymous hospital employee. The internet exploded. National news networks ran the footage on a continuous loop. Protests erupted outside the Seattle Police Department demanding severe accountability. But Lawson didn't even make it to a disciplinary hearing. 48 hours after the incident, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to Lawson's suburban home. Heavily armed FBI agents kicked his front door off its hinges, dragging Lawson out of his bed in his underwear. He was thrown face first onto his own lawn and handcuffed. A brutal, poetic mirroring of the humiliation he had inflicted on Terrence. Lawson thought his police union would save him. They always had before. But this time, the victim wasn't a marginalized citizen without a voice. The victim was a highly esteemed black surgeon, and the secondary victim was a federal judge. The union president took one look at the federal indictment, released a swift public statement condemning Lawson's rogue and unforgivable actions, and completely severed all legal and financial support. Lawson was entirely on his own. The state attorney general, David Harrison, wasn't about to let this slip into a quiet plea deal. He wanted a public execution of Lawson's freedom to save the city's political face. Lawson was charged with aggravated assault, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, reckless endangerment, and the most devastating charge of all, attempted manslaughter of a federal official. The trial was swift, public, and merciless. During the proceedings, Lawson sat at the defense table looking like a shattered shell of a man. He had lost 30 pounds. His uniform was replaced by a drab Orange County Jail jumpsuit. He wept openly, begging for mercy, claiming he was just stressed, claiming he made a mistake, claiming it wasn't about race. Then Dr. Taryn Holden took the stand. Terrence wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit. He didn't look angry. He looked authoritative, untouched. When the prosecutor asked him to recount the events, Terrence spoke with the same calm, commanding baritone that controlled his operating rooms. I told him the patient would die, Terrence testified, his eyes locking onto Lawson. I told him my ID was in the locker. I told him he was risking a man's life. I didn't care. He looked at me, a surgeon saving a life, and saw only a black man he believed he was entitled to break. He nearly cost a man his life to satisfy his own fragile ego. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the presiding judge, a longtime colleague of Pendleton's, looked down at Lawson with utter disgust. You are a disgrace to the badge you wore and a danger to the public you swore to protect. You weaponized your authority and nearly committed murder through your own arrogant, racist negligence. Bradley Lawson was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Because he was a former cop, he would serve that time in protective custody, locked in a tiny cell for 23 hours a day, entirely isolated from the outside world. As the bailiffs hauled a sobbing, hyperventilating Lawson out of the courtroom, Terrence stood up from the gallery. Lawson locked eyes with him, silently pleading for some kind of forgiveness, some shred of pity. Terrence just adjusted his cuffs, turned his back, and walked out the heavy oak doors, returning to a life of saving people. Lawson was escorted down into the dark, returning to the absolute nothingness he had built for himself. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been delivered with the precision of a scalpel.